What I do want to do right now, though, is introduce the Secretary, who has been standing by very patiently, and maybe we can ask him some of these questions as well. Mr. Secretary, come on up. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. It's actually quite fascinating getting the end of the tax briefing.
You're getting the extent. Well, we have a lot of people here. Grover's here. You can see Mark Zandi's over there. We got Glenn Hubbard. We had a whole. Where's Steve Ratner? I don't know. We have a whole group here, and there's some really remarkable people here this afternoon. I have a series of questions, and then I do want to open up because I know there are people here who do. So we're going to pretend this is like TV.
Wait, I thought I was going to get to ask you questions.
Oh, you can. You want to? What do you want to do?
So, are you more famous for CNBC or Billions?
For the New York Times.
Or the New York Times.
How about that? We'll go with the Times. We'll go with the Times. Here's where I want to start the conversation. You were on TV this morning, as it happens, talking about China, and you seem to sound a note of optimism about the state of these negotiations. It seemed like. I don't know if you think that's an accurate way to put it, but I wanted to read you, because I was reading Tom Friedman in the New York Times, no less, just yesterday, and he just got back from China, and he said that he left feeling that President Xi is less likely to sign on to the kind of grand bargain and broad concessions that the president is demanding. And that's in part because Xi would get too much pushback from his state-owned industries and Communist Party hardliners. And I wanted to understand the juxtaposition of what Tom was saying and what I think you've been thinking, unless you're in agreement.
Let me first put this in context, because these issues have been going on for the last 20 years through both parties. So this is not necessarily a party issue or a philosophical issue. President Trump came into office, and at the first meeting that he had with President Xi, this was on the agenda. And President Trump said that we need to rebalance the trading relationship, that this is a one-way street, that you're able to invest in the U.S. freely, you're able to export freely. We want fair and reciprocal trade, and President Xi agreed to that. And I think, as you know, for the last 2.5 years, we've been at different stages of executing this. I wouldn't make the comment whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I'd make the comment that the next month is important. I take them in good faith. We're going to have a deputies level meeting, I believe it's next week, to do preliminary work, followed by the beginning of October, a meeting with the Vice Premier and Ambassador Lighthizer and myself. And we're hopeful we'll make progress. If we can get the right deal, we'll do a deal.
Okay. Within the administration, the departure of Mr. Bolton, does that change any of the dynamics for you?
No.
At all? Does it make it easier?
Not at all. Nothing against Ambassador Bolton, but these are the president's strategies. This is executing on the president, and I think that we're much more unified on these issues than the external world would in any way like to report it.
Okay, here's a different question. Brad Smith was here earlier from Microsoft, and we were talking about Huawei and its role in these negotiations. Is there a way to use, it feels that Huawei has become a bit of a pawn, if you will, in these negotiations. Could you see the president trading something on Huawei for the trade deal?
No, and I don't think it's fair to say that it's a pawn. And I think, one of the things about the Treasury role is I span a lot of different issues in the administration. So I sit on the National Security Council, and I'm obviously focused on economic issues as well. So I get to see both sides of this. Part of the Huawei issue is clearly a national security issue. There's no question about that, and we've had discussions with our allies on it. There are other parts of the Huawei issue that are not. And what President Trump said to President Xi last time was, we will consider licenses for things that are not of national security concern.
But is there, I think the question is, when Huawei gets painted as a national security threat, how it's possible to make a deal over that. And there are people who by the way, Democrats and Republicans, who think Huawei needs to effectively just be shut down completely.
Well, again, I think when you say there are people who think it should be shut down, I think there are people on one side of the spectrum who would like them not to do business in the United States. I think that's not saying they should be necessarily shut down in China.
Okay, let me ask you a separate question. This was something that Brad Smith and I were also talking about just earlier. What do you think the difference is between the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese government and the relationship between the U.S. government and U.S. business? And the
Very different.
But the reason I ask the question is because I think there's a view that the Chinese can ask Huawei to go use their systems to bug other people and do other things. But I also think there's a view, and we heard it actually to some degree from Brad, though I think he thinks there's more protections for him to say no. But clearly the U.S. government is often asking U.S. businesses to help.
Well, you're commenting on things that I obviously am not about to comment on, because obviously I'm privy to information and I can't comment on these things. I would just say categorically, I think there is a giant difference between the two things that you're describing.
In terms of those relationships?
Absolutely.
Because one can be a forced issue and the other can't.
I mean, again, I don't want to go through all the details, but I don't think it's fair to say in any way that the relationship in the United States between the government and private businesses is the same as the relationship between China and state-owned, state enterprise businesses. Now, where Huawei fits in, again, you know, I'm not going to comment specifically on that, but you're talking about different relationships.
Related question, and I also asked Brad this. What do you think it means to be a patriotic company in America today? And the reason we were talking about this is there are so many American companies, especially in the Valley today, who have historically done business with the U.S. government, but have recently become reticent. And I don't know if that's a political view. I don't know if you have a view that that's because they disagree with the administration. I don't know if you think it's an ethical or moral view. But put that all sort of in a frame in terms of how you think about it, in terms of how business relates to the government right now.
Well, I think in the United States, we support private enterprise and private rights. And there's a whole different level of spectrum in regards to how companies act. Obviously, companies have different constituencies, whether it's boards or shareholders or customers. And there's all different ways that companies can act with the government. Now, I would also say it depends on what industry you're in. There are certain industries where the businesses get a lot of benefits from the government. So clearly, I don't think it should be a one-way street, but I think what you're touching on is a complicated issue. But I'd say, look, we believe in private enterprise and we believe in a capitalistic society.
Well, let me ask you then about that, because the other related issue to this is that when you think a little bit about the way the government assigns contracts or doesn't to U.S. enterprise, there has been, and I'm going to give you an example of this. Right now, there's a question about whether Amazon and AWS is going to continue to have this $10 billion Pentagon contract. And there's a view that politics are involved in that. And that's why I'm sort of get at that sort of central core of how you think those things come together.
Well, let me just say, some of these issues are very complicated issues. And I don't think in any way they're as simple as political issues. Again, I can't comment on the specifics of the DoD contract. I can tell you that I am aware of, and I've been briefed on the issues of transferring to the cloud. It is something that I've spoken to many of the agencies and we've looked at, and I think the idea of using the cloud and using external vendors is something that's very important for the government. On the other hand, I think from the government standpoint, we do need to balance these risks, specifically in industries where there are very few providers of the services and what dependence the government ultimately has. Since when we move these things, these are long-term relationships. Some of them have to do with issues of encryption and complex issues, but I can assure you this is way beyond a political issue. I think another complex issue on Amazon is you have one of the largest cloud providers attached to a giant retailer. So, I mean, one of the questions is, who knows what Amazon looks like 10 years down the road? Are they still attached or are they not attached?
Okay, well, let me ask you that. We've had a conversation today about antitrust in America, and right now there's obviously a lot of attention on those big companies. When you look back, actually, maybe the question is to look even at Microsoft. Do you think that it was an advantage, that it was the right thing for the U.S. government to ultimately go after Microsoft? Did that make the Silicon Valley more competitive?
I mean, to be honest with you, there's a lot of things I consider myself an expert on. That's not one of them, and I don't know enough of the facts to look back and have a view on that.
How do you look at then this current crop? Apple, Amazon. I know they're all hate being called big tech and being lobbed into one thing, but if you think about Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google together right now.
Again, I think it's easy to group all these technology companies because they're all big technology companies. I think they're all very different. I mean, if you take Apple as an example, Apple is in a very competitive business with Samsung.
Right.
They're also in a competitive business with Huawei. So again, I think it's unfair to say, look, we should just look at the antitrust issues, that all these companies have the same issues. They have very different issues. I have said, and again, this isn't in my domain, but I do think the Justice Department will look at some of these issues as it relates to some of these companies.
Okay, this is a hard one for you. Your boss, just because you mentioned Amazon, your boss goes on Twitter and calls the leader of Amazon, Jeff Bozo. What do you think of that when you see that? I'm just curious.
Look, the president, going back to the campaign, came up with some very creative names for people. So I think people understand how he uses these names.
But in practice, as part of this larger negotiation that's just going on every single day, do you call him and say, I really wish you hadn't said that?
There's lots of things on policies and everything else that I talk to the president about. I really don't get into these issues.
The name calling?
I wouldn't call it name calling. I would, again, but...
Okay, I have a different one for you, but related. I don't know if you saw this earlier this week. Elliott Management, the activist firm, decided that they were going to go after AT&T. And the president put out a tweet saying, great news that an activist investor is now involved with AT&T. Now, of course, he's very upset with CNN. But as the Treasury Secretary, somebody who deals with business every day, how do you think about that?
I think it's always great if investors get more involved with companies. I think, quite frankly, one of the biggest problems we have is that boards are not active enough, that large shareholders are not active enough. We have obviously a huge amount of assets that are going into index funds. So I think shareholders should be well represented.
Okay, so that's actually very interesting because there is a view, especially when it comes to this idea that people need to be more long-term thinking, that actually activist shareholders have not helped that cause.
I think quite the opposite. I think many times, I mean, you know, look at a Warren Buffett. I mean, he's a very, very long-term holder. He's as much as an activist as other people.
Why would you say Warren Buffett would be an activist in that way?
In the sense of he's focused on long-term values and long-term creation. He's a long-term
But the view
holder.
is that activists come in, make some trouble.
That's your view. You're categorizing how you refer to an activist.
So how do you refer?
You're using it in what I consider to be more of a derogatory term, as opposed to an activist could be an active investor. Obviously, private equity is definitely an active investor. So, I mean, private equity buys companies because they think they can run them better.
Okay. I'm going to pivot the conversation. We actually, as you saw, had a big debate about taxes just now.
No, I was actually found that quite interesting.
And it was fascinating. But I do want to ask you about where we are and this idea. One of the questions that was raised that I think you may have missed was this idea that we need more revenue. Broadly speaking, we need more revenue. If you look at the deficit, as you very well know, it looks like it's now going to get to over $1 trillion for 2020 for the first time. And so the question that I would ask you, especially given that there's even conversations about a tax cut, and I want to understand what the tax 2.0 cut may look like, how do you raise more revenue right now?
Well, the number one way you raise more revenue is through growth. So I think when we look at, you know, debt and sustainability, we look at debt relative to GDP. I think that when the president came into office, the number one economic issue he was focused was growing the economy. That for a long time we had very low growth. There were people who said we could never grow at high numbers again. We had wages that hadn't grown, and we came with an economic plan and said, look, you can't cut your way to prosperity, you have to grow your way. And again, we've grown revenues. Now, I just want to comment on one thing, because people, when I've talked about the tax cuts paying for themselves, or you look at the deficit and things like that, one of the things we did in the tax bill was we allowed for automatic expensing. So obviously, that is a front loading of investment and a back end in terms of revenues. We've actually grown tax receipts 3%, despite the fact that we allowed for a lot of expensing. So part of this is when you look at the deficit, you can't just look at it a moment in time. You have to look at what are we going to do over a 5 or 10 year period to fix these issues.
You think it's unfair to say that when you said initially when they're campaigning for the tax plan, that it would pay for itself?
I still think it will. Absolutely. The difference is 35 basis points of growth.
No, in terms of your expectation of where we would be today.
Absolutely. We're ahead of where we thought we'd be today. I never said I thought it would pay for itself in year one. What I said is over a 10-year window, which is the way we analyze taxes, it will pay for itself. And again, this is just math. If over this 10-year window we grow an extra 35 basis points a year, it will have paid for itself.
This is a longer conversation, and I know there's some tax experts in the room. I'll let them ask more on this, but I have a couple of quick other questions, and then we'll open it up. One, 50-year bond. Is it worth doing?
I think so. I mean, and I've talked about this. So again, this is something we looked at starting 2 years ago. I think it's part of what we're looking at is we do have obviously a lot of debt at low interest rates, de-risking the government's position. So we're looking at potentially extending the portfolio. And as part of that, one of the tools we'll look at, if there is proper demand, we will issue 50-year bonds.
Why not 100 years?
Well, we're going to start with 50 years. And if the answer is 50 years are successful, we'll consider 100-year bonds.
Right. How worried are you about interest rates right now in this country, and specifically what's happening in Europe and what it may ultimately mean here, and then therefore the power of the dollar and everything else?
Well, I think, as you know, in my role as Treasury Secretary,
I
I'm
know.
not going to specifically comment on interest rates in the United States, but I will comment on interest rates in Europe. I think that low interest rates are good for economic growth. I think negative interest rates, unclear whether they're good for economic growth. I think that negative interest rates are bad for a banking business. It's hard to grow an economy without having a healthy banking business. Be interesting to see what happens in Europe. I don't know why. I mean, I think the other thing we're going to see is with the spread between where 10-year treasuries are and 10-year German bonds, my expectation is you're going to see a big flow of funds.
Right. Maybe 2 or 3 others real quick, and then we will open it up, I promise. First, we were talking about the Business Roundtable and their proposal that came out 2 weeks ago, where it effectively, there's now a conversation about purpose over profits, if you will. You're a former investor. What do you think of what's happening in corporate America today? A, is it real, and is it good?
I think it's a complicated issue, and I think a little bit like I heard talking about taxes. When the VAT tax started in Europe, also it started as a very little tax, and people said, "Oh, it's not going to really have much impact." And every year they kept raising the VAT tax. I think the problem with this conversation is profits are what create investments, or what create jobs to be reinvested. And if you go down this road and say, oh, we no longer care about profits, we only care about purpose, you're not going to have a very vibrant business community. Now, that's different than saying, I do think companies should be long-term oriented. I don't think companies need to necessarily focus on quarterly profits and hitting street earnings numbers. But I think ultimately a business's job is to deploy the capital correctly and to make profits.
So there was, I think, about 5 holdouts who were members of the Business Roundtable. Stephen Schwartzman from Blackstone was one of them. If you were a member of the Business Roundtable, do you think you would have signed it?
I wouldn't have.
You wouldn't have signed it?
No.
That's fascinating. And it's fundamentally because you disagree with the premise.
Again, I think it's not I wouldn't have signed it because I think it's not a simple answer. So in other words, people on a lot of these issues want a 1-sentence or 2-sentence answer. So again, I don't think it's Obviously, businesses should have a purpose. To be profitable, you have to have a purpose. I think it's not as simple as saying we either have a purpose or we have profits. I think the problem with creating these a simple answer is it doesn't fully explore the issues. So I personally think companies need to both have a purpose and have profits.
Okay, let me ask you a different question then. I don't know if you saw the news today, and I've been writing about this a lot in the paper recently. 145 CEOs in America wrote a letter to senators saying, pass the bill on gun violence. Both.
Yeah, again, I will say, again, I have a lot of expertise. Gun laws are not my area of expertise.
But let me ask you this, though. You saw Walmart just a couple of weeks ago decide that they were no longer going to stock certain types of products, ammunition, and other things like that. There's a view on one side that this is what business should be doing. They should be using their role to do what they think is good for their business, and others who think that this is like part of a culture war and business should not be part of this conversation. And so I'm sort of curious where you land on that, irrespective of the issue itself.
I think you're talking about two different things. So one is you're talking about businesses writing to Congress about certain positions, which, again, I think in general, people have the right to have their opinions. I think this is a complicated issue that Congress is looking at.
Right.
Again, I think it's up. Again, it's an issue that's a complicated issue that business is looking at.
But I'll tell you, I'll throw one other piece at it, and it's just interesting to me because Citigroup and Bank of America and some others last year decided that they were not going to they were trying to distance themselves effectively from gun manufacturers. And when they did that, they got a lot of attaboys from some customers, and there were other customers who were upset. But interestingly, this is where the political part of it becomes so unique. There were lawmakers in certain states, there were even a member of the SEC who effectively went after some of these companies.
Well, again, I'm just saying these are complicated issues, but you're talking about banks that are regulated and have FDIC insurance, which is a benefit. And again, I think as it relates to any discrimination of laws, it's not the role of banks to discriminate against any laws. So I think part of the pushback specifically on banks, again, is part of a broader view, which is if all of a sudden banks start picking, we like these laws, we don't like those laws, you lead to discrimination. Slightly different issue, and again, banks have a different obligation because they take insurance from the government.
But you, by the way, work with banks right now in a sort of a post-9/11 world for money laundering purposes.
Absolutely.
Human trafficking. You know, I've argued you could use the banking system to look for suspicious buying patterns related to guns, and that would actually be a very helpful thing.
Well, we do a lot of things without commenting what we do. Obviously, our role of working with the banks in combating all different types of terrorist activities is something that we take great pride in.
Okay, I want to open up. I have just one final very quick question for you. You asked me a question about TV, so I'll ask you a question about TV since you're a producer yourself as well, and a much more successful one than I ever was. There's a whole new streaming war that's coming, as you know, between Apple with their Plus service and Disney Plus service and Amazon and Netflix. Do you want to pick a winner?
You know, I'm not allowed to pick a winner, but I will say, so I can't comment on that because that would be endorsing something, which I'm now better educated on. But I will say, look, I think it's terrific there's this type of competition.
Okay, we're going to leave it there, but I know there's so many people and there's microphones around the room, so and the Treasury Secretary has been kind enough to stay with us for another 5 or 10 minutes. We have a question there, and then I'll go to David Sanger.
Thank you, Secretary. I'm Vicki Arroyo with Georgetown. And I'm pleased to hear you say that companies should be long-term oriented. And as someone who works on climate change, I'm wondering what your philosophy is about how the government should be long-term oriented on this existential threat.
Obviously you have a view because you've made a conclusion at the end of your question. So I assume you have a view on this. Again, I would put climate change is also a very, very complicated issue where, you know, the science is not clear on the different issues, on different things. Now, again, I would say, let me just give you an example. Okay? You know, I drove an electric car when I was able to drive, and I loved my electric car, and I liked the idea of driving an electric car. Ultimately, these electric cars and these batteries and everything else are going to create a lot of environmental issues. So I only use this as just as an example of, again, not my area of expertise, so I can't comment on it, but I can tell you, I do think the president and this administration very much cares about clean air, clean water. I do think US companies have been very focused on cutting emissions. And I think one of the great things is the US has an abundance of energy. I mean, liquid natural gas is very, very clean, tremendous abundance of LNG.
Let me ask you just a follow-up question, which relates to the automobile industry. In terms of some of the rollbacks that the administration is proposing on some of the automotive rules, some of the car makers think that the administration has gone too far.
I was kind of surprised to hear that the car makers again felt that way, but again, not my area of expertise.
Okay, it's a longer conversation. David Sanger.
Secretary David Sanger, I'm the national security correspondent for the Times. You've been very active in the Iran sanctions, and we have seen in recent days the French issue a proposal for a $15 billion line of credit for Iran, guaranteed by their oil. And we've seen the president seemingly open to thinking about a line of credit. So tell us, would this undercut the sanctions as you are imagining them? Is it a relief on the maximum pressure campaign that you've talked so much about?
Sure. So thank you. I think that's a good question. So let me clarify some of these issues. And let me first say, you know, there's certain things I came into government I knew a lot about. There's certain things I didn't know anything about. Sanctions was one of the things in national security. Tremendous career staff at Treasury. You know, I feel like I got a PhD in my first 90 days, and we're very proud of the fact that at Treasury we've done more sanctions than have ever been done before. And they are a very, very important national security tool. They absolutely work. So first, let me just say, as it relates to Iran, the sanctions are working. There is no question that they're having an economic impact on Iran. And the only reason why they're contemplating changes behavior or conversation or everything else is because of the economic issues. We have had, I've participated in direct discussions with President Trump and President Macron on these issues. Secretary Pompeo and I work very actively together. The French understand clearly that they cannot give a line of credit without our consent, that it would be a violation of the sanctions. So there is not a, quote, proposal from France right now to give the Iranians $15 billion. There are various different discussions going along the way. I've seen some reporting recently, which is misinformation that I or other people want to loosen up on sanctions. Secretary Pompeo and I are executing the president's strategy of maximum pressure, and we think it's working. Simultaneously, the president has said he's willing to sit down and have a conversation with no conditions. So that's our strategy.
Okay, let's sneak in.
Did I answer your question clearly enough?
I'm not sure whether we understand whether the administration is willing to consider the French proposal in order to get those negotiations going.
Again, I'm not going to go into any confidential discussions, but let me just repeat, which is we are executing a maximum pressure campaign. That is what we're doing. And the French understand that they can't give a $15 billion line of credit without our consent.
Okay, why don't we go rapid fire, because I know there's lots of hands over here, and then we'll get over to John Hope Bryant as well.
Mr. Secretary, David Damschen, Utah State Treasurer, thank you so much for joining us. There's roughly $26 billion in federal savings bonds that are matured and no longer accruing interest. Senator Kennedy, as you may be aware, has dropped a bill that would allow information related to those monies to be passed to state treasurers. State treasurers are very good at reuniting lost monies with their rightful owner. What are your feelings about Treasury assisting treasurers in reuniting those lost monies with rightful owners, $26 billion? Thank you.
So, you know, I just read this article as I was coming up. I think it was a political article on how I'm such a micromanager, which I take as a great compliment, by the way, and my looking at all the tax regs. But I can tell you, me being a micromanager, I actually understand this issue extremely well. So part of the problem is a lot of these records are on very, very old microfiche, even if we have the records. So the problem that we're trying to figure out is, I mean, first of all, we want to get the money back to the rightful holders. We want to get them to the holders. How you go about doing that, because the average amount of money that a person has is very, we're talking about very, very small per person, although it's big in the aggregate. And a lot of time, the cost to the government to figure out who actually has it is going to be more expensive than the person has. So I've had multiple meetings. I probably had a dozen meetings on this specific issue, and us trying to figure out how we can work with the states. And I think we're starting a pilot program, but I appreciate it, and we're working on it.
I think we have one more over here. By the way, the flip side of that, by the way, is the tax group wants to get more money, obviously just even get more money for the IRS. Would you be in favor of the IRS having a much bigger budget?
I would. So I mean, again, when I say a much bigger budget, we are advocating for more money for the IRS. One of the things we want more money for is technology modernization. I think, as you know, we have the largest database of personal information, particularly in this cybersecurity issue. I think that one, we need to make sure we protect it, and two, taxpayers deserve better online information. There's no reason why, as a taxpayer, people shouldn't have the same level of communication. But is it more
about that or more about enforcement?
Well, again, if we have better technology, we can use the technology for enforcement. And a lot of information is matched today. So yes, we're advocating for more money for the IRS.
Okay, I know the treasurer may have to go in a moment.
I'll take a couple more questions.
John O'Brien.
And then we'll let you go.
Mr. Secretary, first of all...
Hey, John, and thank you for everything you're doing. Terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your efforts around the Freedmen's Bank. Thank you for your efforts around the qualified opportunity zones, which I think the potential of which is still in front of us. And thank you and Auding for the efforts around CRA reform, which would hopefully direct billions of dollars into underserved neighborhoods. Still working on all that. With regard to repairing the ladder of aspiration that was referred to by Abigail and others earlier, what would you think philosophically about providing tax relief and or tax break, however you want to structure it, to the wealthy individuals or corporations who facilitate massive internships and massive apprenticeships for those who are not in the room? I keep saying that if you hang around 9 broke people, you'll be the 10th. So we've got to get folks who are brilliant and amazing but unconnected back in from the streets into the suites. And I think internships and apprenticeships does that, but I think there needs to be an incentive to do it philosophically. I know it's not exactly your lane, but you have incredible influence in this whole dialogue and this discussion. Philosophically, is this something that you think might work?
Well, first of all, let me just say, again, I appreciate the work you've done in these areas. I think apprenticeships are very important. I also think, and this is an area, you know, we've worked with you on, financial literacy is also very important. So some of these issues, and Ivanka Trump has done a great job spearheading this out of the White House with many companies. Job training, apprenticeship, incentivizing companies to do this, and cutting back regulations so that companies can do it effectively. Anything we can do to increase this area, and yes, philosophically, if we had to look at tax benefits, that's something that we'd consider.
Okay, I see a microphone. Alex Berenson.
Secretary. People say terrible things about you online, you and your wife. Your boss, you know, is known for being uncivil to a lot of people. Both in terms generally of what's said on Twitter and specifically about this administration's relationship with the press, which I think is, you know, toxic on both sides. The president has said the press is the enemy of the people. the press pursues him for what is basically an innocent misstatement about Alabama and a hurricane. Is there any way to put the genie back in the bottle, or are we stuck with what we have right now? And how does it feel to be someone who is targeted this way?
Well, I can only talk for myself. I think I have good relationships with plenty of people in the press. That's why I'm here.
I appreciate you being here.
As it relates to online, I think one of the problems, and again, I don't have the answer, but you can go online, for almost any person or any issue, and 50% of the things are broadly nice and 50% of the things are nasty. And again, not my areas of expertise, but as it relates to some of these companies, are they publishers? Should there be some level of responsibility for it? I don't know the answer, but you're touching on a lot of complicated issues. And online has taken a very, very important role. And in many ways, it's very good. I mean, I do think the fact that the president and other people can communicate as broadly as they can through an online channel is actually, I think, a good thing. I mean, there was a time where the press, filtered everything. That's no longer the case. But I think you raise some very important issues as it relates to issues online and other things.
Okay. On that note, we want to thank you.
Thank you
for this conversation. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you very, very much.
Terrific.
Mr. Secretary, thank you
Pleasure.
so much. Great to see you. And that's a wrap, everybody. We just wanted to thank everybody here for participating in today's activities, and we really think that we've started something here, and we hope that you've created some relationships and learned something. We've learned from you, and I know that we will all be learning a lot more from you, the public that is, next week when this special section of the New York Times all about what just took place today will be in the newspaper. So thank you. We're going to have drinks now. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Ladies.